I think I've always been a 2D Zelda fan. The only issue is I hadn't played many. Most of my experience with the old 2D formula was Link's Awakening, Oracle of Ages, and Oracle of Seasons when I was in my early teenage years. Only recently did I play through and finish A Link to the Past, though I didn't enjoy it as much as the Game Boy titles, or at least that's what my nostalgia for them would have me believe. Having not really fallen in love with the 3D stylings of Zelda that everyone else seemed to, like Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, Breath of the Wild, and others, I found myself really craving those old 2D dungeons and puzzles that I love so much. In comes Blossom Tales, the first game I ever purchased for my Switch, and I got to almost relive those wonderful experiences all over again. Today's review will be covering Blossom Tales 2, The Minotaur Prince, the successor to the original, and I'll make it clear right off the bat. This game is wonderful. There will be some slight spoilers here and there to help me talk about some of the overall principles of the game, but nothing unexpected from a Zelda-inspired indie. This review will be covering aspects of the first game, seeing as how this sequel is essentially just more of that. I wasn't sure how to feel about the graphical style when I first encountered it, but that feeling quickly wore off and the aesthetic started to feel like home. The pixel art here is beautiful, albeit more detailed on some structures or enemies than others, but beautiful nonetheless. I do think this game would have benefited from slightly more interesting environments, as a large portion of the map feels similar to others, but just different enough to give the player feedback they're in a new landscape. The one that stood out to me more than the others was the desert area, mostly because it lacked the greenery that a lot of the other areas share in common to slightly different degrees. I'm not at all saying the environmental design is bad. The way everything is laid out with hidden collectibles and puzzles defined is excellent. I would have just preferred some more diversity in the biomes. For example, the first game had a snowy area that I really enjoyed. Maybe a lava biome or something like that would have been cool. The menu UI is fine. Nothing crazy here one way or the other. It accomplishes its purpose with multiple tabs depending on what you're looking for. I did feel like the inventory got a bit bloated towards the end, but honestly the item designs are distinctive enough both in design and vibrance that you won't have any issues finding what you're looking for. The tab specifically for the music related mechanic is very welcome, as I sucked at remembering the combinations, even though most of them were pretty simple. Things like cracks in the walls that can be opened by bombs, digging spots, even small details in the minimap are communicated to the player very clearly. I don't think there was ever a time where I was unsure of how a puzzle or mechanic worked without quickly figuring it out thanks to the subtle hints the game gives you in its design, like literal targets as switches for the bow and arrow. Admittedly, I don't have much to say about the music, except it's fantastic. I remember listening to the soundtrack of the first game while I was working or doing things around my apartment. This game is no different. I find myself humming the main overworld theme once or twice a day, and there's a really nice track in the final area that is very triumphant, but also intense. It really gives you a sense that you're at the end of your journey and that you're really being tested. All the sound effects are unique, but definitely hit you at the perfect time if you're a fan of the genre. A nice little jingle plays when you find a secret, for instance, and the sound of picking up 3 or 4 treasure chests worth of coins is pure ecstasy. We'll keep this one short and sweet. Performance is flawless. I don't think I hit a single point in the game where it felt like the frames dipped or the game was chugging. It was buttery smooth all the way through. I played on Switch and the load times were maybe a second between maps, if that, and these are not your standard one-screen maps from Link's Awakening. Each of the maps in this game is more like 3 or 4 of those combined. If it wasn't for my desire to be as consistent as possible in these reviews, I wouldn't have even mentioned performance because it was perfect throughout. This is likely the only category I'll offer critiques on because the game was highly enjoyable almost all the way around. There's just a few things I'd like to see change slightly for future titles. As I've mentioned several times over at this point, this game heavily draws on the old top-down hack and slash style of gameplay with some really cool tools and weapons you can add into the fray as well. These tools are also homages to items you may remember from those Game Boy Zelda titles. For instance, one of the first tools you get is a pair of floaties, which are basically the flippers that allow you to swim. There are a couple of things here that I don't remember being in the previous game, as well as items that did not make a return in this sequel, but I won't mention any of them here due to spoilers. Here's where I'd like to talk about my first small critique. The game seems a bit on the easy side. Maybe this game is marketed more towards a younger audience, though I didn't get that impression. Most of the puzzles had very easy and obvious solutions, and I didn't feel much challenge from them or the enemies and bosses throughout most of the game. However, the final area of the game as well as the final dungeon and boss were excellent, and it's what I would have liked to see as the baseline or the first few challenges in the game and then build from that. I'm not saying I disliked my time with the game because of the low level of difficulty, I just would have liked to see it raised a notch or two. The puzzles are fun as well as the boss fights, but there were very few of those rewarding moments you get from conquering something difficult in that aspect. Going back to tools for a moment, you have a HUD that shows you which tools or weapons you have equipped, and you can use A, B, or Y for those tools with the X button allowing you to dodge roll. What I would have liked to see here is the option to tie more tools to things like your shoulder buttons or button combinations. Going into your menu constantly to switch items around is nostalgic, that's for sure, but not exactly fun to do now. Disengaging from the gameplay to switch items in and out in a menu isn't exactly great after the 100th time. A lot of the mini-games and quests were pretty fun, but one addition I really liked is a lot of the collectibles that you can use to craft potions or trade to people for heart and stamina containers. It gives you an actual reason for destroying everything in your path while you explore, like cutting blades of grass or destroying boulders with bombs. The last semi-negative I'll mention here is a marker system for the minimap would have been very welcomed. There were so many things that I wanted to come back to after acquiring the right tools or unlocking certain things that I just completely forgot about and never went back to. The minimap is somewhat detailed when you zoom in, but not enough for the smaller stuff like a crack in the wall. Being able to add a marker to come back to later would have been great. I think I ended up exploring the entire overworld about 3 times to try to find everything, but honestly I was over it after the second time. A few final but minor notes to mention here. If you're a fan of the genre or a fan of the game series I've mentioned several times over featuring a green tunicked hero, you'll recognize a lot of the attack patterns the enemies have. There are a few quality of life features that you unlock as you progress as well, but I don't want to spoil them here. Hopefully this section doesn't come off as incredibly negative. All this is very nitpicky because the gameplay is tried and true and has been for years. Blossom Tales nails it just as well as Nintendo ever did. The story follows Lily and Chris at a campfire having a grand tale being told to them by their grandfather in which the kids themselves are the main protagonist. Not a whole lot to say about this other than the story is very lighthearted and doesn't take itself too seriously, eliciting a chuckle from me every so often. There was one really cool mechanic I liked where as the tale was being told, Lily would come across some enemies and the two kids would argue over which type of enemy it was. Ultimately, Grandpa would allow you to choose which one it was and you got to fight the enemies based on the choice you made. The story is very silly and I wouldn't recommend playing the game for the story alone. It's definitely second to the gameplay and the overall design here. I had so much fun with Blossom Tales that I find myself wanting to play through both games again sometime in the near future. Wonderful top-down gameplay, fun collectibles, finding giant caches of coins hidden in a crack in the wall. All that Blossom Tales has to offer is fun and exciting, especially if you miss those old Zelda Game Boy titles like I do. I'd definitely like to see a challenge mode or a difficulty option in the future, but honestly, they've clearly hit a stride here that they can continue on to the next game and likely get the exact same enthusiasm, at least from me. I highly recommend this one as well as the first game. Even if you're not generally into this genre, I wouldn't be surprised if Blossom Tales turned you into a fan by showing you just how much fun this style of gameplay can be. Thank you all so much for watching, and until next time, bye!